Hey guys, it's Samantha Leanne, and today I'm going to be doing my October wrap-up. I'm going to be talking about the books that I read and how I felt about them, if I would recommend them, and then I will briefly talk about some of the things that I plan to read for November. Now, I'm not going to do a separate video for my TBR or anything for November because I don't really like setting TBRs. I feel very restricted by them. To me, if I sit down and make a list, okay, these are the things that I have to read, then it kind of takes the fun out of it for me. And if I decide that I don't want to read those things, then it just kind of, I don't know. It's just, it takes the fun out of it and I don't enjoy it as much. Let me start off by saying, excuse my rough appearance because I did just finish working, a full shift today and I am kind of exhausted, but I wanted to go ahead and get this recorded. So, okay. So this month I read 6 different books. I did read a couple of them on audio. Well, I listened to a couple of them on audio, but I'll talk more about the specifics of those whenever we actually get into those books. So, let's go ahead and get started. So the first book that I'm going to talk about today is The Other Queen by Philippa Gregory. This one is about Mary, Queen of Scots. It's one of the first ones that I've read with anything really about her. So this book is actually told in 3 different perspectives. It's told at varying times through the perspective of Mary, Queen of Scots, Bess of Hardwicke, and her husband, Lord Shrewsbury, who are basically housing her for Queen Elizabeth. I did really enjoy that it gave 3 different perspectives. Like I said, I wasn't super familiar with the life of Mary, Queen of Scots. This did give me a little bit of insight to it, but not necessarily a whole lot. It was more... I don't want to say that it was more about Bess and her husband, but there was more narration done by them, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it didn't really give me the insight to Mary, Queen of Scots that I really wanted. It was not a bad book. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It's definitely not her strongest, but it's not her weakest. We'll get to some of her weakest in a few minutes. But again, I just really didn't like that it didn't give as much time to Queen Mary, but you know, it was an okay read. Did have some good information in it. There was I don't want to say there was inaccuracy, but there was just a little bit of inaccuracy. But yeah, 3 out of 5. So that's how I felt about this one. So the next book that I read was, you guys are going to kind of sense a theme here in a minute, was The Virgin's Lover, also by Philippa Gregory. This does seem like it would be really trashy. And there were parts of it that were trashy, don't get me wrong, but it was a lot about the relationship that was between Queen Elizabeth and one of her childhood friends, Robert Dudley. This is in history. You can read about it if you want to. And it is told third person, but we get a little bit of insight about Queen Elizabeth and what she was going through we say what she was going through, but an imaginative version of what she was going through and her thoughts behind some of the things that she did during that time period, as well as Robert Dudley himself and through his wife. We talk a little bit about his wife, whose name is Amy Dudley. That is what her name is. But this is another 3 out of 5. Again, it's not her strongest, but it's not her worst. I would say that if I had to rank The Other Queen and The Virgin's Lover, I would probably rank The Other Queen a little bit higher than I would this one. Again, not that it was a bad book, but it wasn't her strongest, and there were parts of it where I was like, okay, I'm done with this. Like, can we move on? So yeah, 3 out of 5. Okay, so next book is, are you sensing a theme? The Queen's Fool, also by Philippa Gregory. This one is told from the perspective of one of the Queen's Fools. Her name is Hannah Green. And it's told from her perspective, going through working in the court of King Edward, and then Queen Mary and then Queen Elizabeth and some of the things that happened to her personally. I was not really feeling the narrator on this one. I did not really like her character. I was interested to see what Gregory could do writing about a fictional character during this time period, and I just really wasn't that impressed with it. The character herself was very wishy-washy, like, I am a strong, independent woman and I don't need no man. And then she did want a man, and well, there was more to it than that, but this wasn't my cup of tea. I gave this one like 2.5 out of 5. Just didn't really feel it. The narrator didn't really do it for me. It did talk about some of the events during that time period, but it wasn't super historical, to be completely honest. I was looking for something more about the Tudor court, and while the Tudor court was actually, part of the narration of this book, it just wasn't what I wanted it to be. I know that sounds really bad. It wasn't what I wanted it to be, but it wasn't my thing. So it is what it is. 2.5 out of 5. So the next book I read was on audio. This was The Taming of the Queen, also by Philippa Gregory, but this was one of her more recent releases. This was about Catherine Parr, who was Henry VIII's last wife and did outlive him. If you are familiar with her history at all, she was actually a very interesting woman. She was one of the first women of that time period to actually publish a book. And they did talk about that during the book, which was interesting to me. It was told from her perspective, so obviously we know that, this is clearly fictional and things didn't quite happen that way, but the direction that she went with it was really weird. In talking about, she went back and forth with how she portrayed Henry, in that he was a monster. Oh no, he's kind of sweet. Oh no, he's a monster. And we all know that history, and kind of how things happen. You can read, hello, sorry, my cat decided to jump into the picture. But if you decided to read Wikipedia, you can, get the backstory if you're unfamiliar with it. But like I said, she took a very strange turn at the end, right before Henry's death, and I just was not feeling that turn that she took. It was very strange. It was over-sexualized to me, which, again, that is I don't want to say that's a staple in her books, because there were several books earlier mentioned where that aspect of it was kept very minimal. There's always like a little piece of it, but this was over-sexualized. It played too much of a role in the way that things happened and the way that things were portrayed in the book. So it was definitely not my favorite, unfortunately, because I really wanted to love it, because again, as you can tell from what I've been reading, the Tudor court is something that I love, but wasn't really feeling it. And again, I don't know, I kept hoping that the next one that I would reach for would be better, but I would just get disappointed again. So, not all that great. Okay, so again, Taming of the Queen, Philippa Gregory gave that one a, oh hello, what are you doing? What are you doing? Stop it. So one of the last books that I read, this is the last Philippa Gregory book, I promise you, was Three Sisters, Three Queens. This was her latest release, so I was kind of having high hopes, hoping that it was going to be better than The Taming of the Queen, and it was. This was told from the perspective of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, and talks about her subsequent marriage to James of Scotland, and after he died, and all of these things in relation to the other superpowers of Europe, as well as obviously her brother, who is King of England, Henry VIII. But we talk about Three Sisters, Three Queens. Obviously, we have Margaret, we have Catherine, Henry's wife, and we have Mary, who is her youngest sister, who was married to the King of France at one point and becomes the Dowager Queen of France. But the book goes through Margaret's life and her marriage to James and the way that things played out there in relation to how things were playing out with the other superpowers of Europe, as well as England, and what their relationship was like. What her relationship was like with her two sisters. And that aspect of it was a little bit interesting, but I gotta tell you, I really, really, really hated the narration in this, and let me tell you why. I hated the narration because Margaret has an inferiority complex, and I'm not going to go into too great of detail. There aren't going to be spoilers, and again, if you want spoilers, you can go to Wikipedia and you can read all about this, because for the most part, that was historically accurate. the events that happened were historically accurate, let me say that. But what she has an inferiority complex. She is consistently comparing herself to Catherine, to Mary. She wants to be the best. It's like when these awful things are happening, the only thing that she can think about is how this makes her less than Catherine, or this makes her less than Mary. And it gets so tiresome because, like, you can understand why she feels that way just because of the time period and the way that women were treated and things like that. But it doesn't make her seem any less whiny, and it doesn't make her any more likable to me. I wrote an actual review on Goodreads that explains this a little bit better than how I can explain it now, because my brain is actually mush because I've been at work for 9 hours. But I will link that down below if you're interested in just getting a little bit more insight to how I felt with that. But I mean, I would give it a solid 3 because it did give me a little bit of insight, and it made me read a little bit more about James of Scotland and you know, things that were happening during that particular time with Scotland, because I'm not super familiar with that. So I will give it a 3 out of 5 simply because of that, but I really, really hated the narration. So the last book that I read this month was The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I loved it. Can I just, oh my God, y'all, I loved it. I did listen to this one as well. I listened to the full cast audio version, which was absolutely wonderful. I highly, highly recommend it. I got it off Audible, but it was an absolutely wonderful book. Like, absolutely contender for my favorite thing that I have read this year. It was, I cannot say enough about this book. And if you haven't read Neil Gaiman, I highly recommend starting with this book because it's really good all around. I got to like the last hour of the audiobook and was like, oh my God, things are happening. And I'm furiously texting one of my best friends because she loves Neil Gaiman as well. And she was actually the person who suggested that I read him. And she thought that it was hilarious because I was freaking out about what was happening. But the book is just absolutely, it's beautifully written. The narration was wonderful. And you really care about the characters. And it wasn't, yeah, it takes place in a graveyard, but there's so much more to it than that. And it's kind of funny because the book opens with a triple homicide, and that's all I'm going to tell you about that. But the book itself was so sweet. And there's so many great quotes from that book that I can't remember any of them off the top of my head. But just things about life in general that I really related to, and I really, really enjoyed it. Absolutely 5 out of 5. One of my favorite books that I read this year, and I highly, highly recommend that you read it. So now is the part where I talk about what I plan on reading for the month of November. I only have a couple of things that I'm going to talk about because, like I said, I don't really like doing TBRs, so there's really just a couple of things that I absolutely for sure know that I'm going to be reading for the month of November. But one of the things that I did start immediately after I finished the Graveyard Book is The Night Circus, and although I have the hard copy in my hand, I actually am currently listening to this. To start reading this, I'm only I'm close to 3 hours in. I believe it's 12 hours runtime total. I don't know where that equates to in the actual book, to be completely honest, but I am really enjoying it so far. It's being narrated by Jim Dale is the person who's narrating this book, or reading it on, it's another Audible edition. But anywho, yeah, so I am currently really enjoying this so far. Really rich imagery, and the narration is spot on. So there is that. And the only other thing that I absolutely 100% plan on reading this month is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I do have the 2 other books in the series as well. I don't know if I'm going to end up reading those after this. It depends on if I feel like picking this up or not, but I do plan on starting this as soon as I finish The Night Circus. Again, I have a hard copy, and then I also have a Audible copy as well. But in talking to one of my best friends, because this is one thing that she actually has read, that we do share in common, she said that it's better to actually read this because of the, if I can find one, which of course I can't. Oh, you know what? They're all over the back cover. Ha ha. But like all the vintage photographs and things like that are part of this. So she said that you kind of get like a better sense of what's going on based on the photographs. So I'm probably going to end up actually reading the copy of this. So Okay guys, so that is what I read for the month of October and what I'm planning on reading for the month of November. Just a couple of things. 6 books was actually a lot for me, so I'm sure that this video is probably a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but it is what it is. Next month's video will also be a little bit shorter. I wasn't planning on actually doing any like outright reviews for any of the books that I've mentioned today. However, if you're interested in me doing a full review of anything that I've read today, please comment down below and let me know. Also, if you have a differing opinion on anything that I read that I wasn't feeling and that you absolutely loved, please comment and let me know how you felt about it. I talked about it in my newbie video. I love discussion, and I would love to discuss why you love these books, because maybe it'll give me a different insight on you know, how I felt about them. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.